Is there any way you can full screen that photo, just bottom right?
Does that do it?
Yes.
Oh.
The talk's now finished.
Have I started the live stream? Yeah, I have. All right, hello and welcome everyone who's come from the talk. We hope you enjoyed that and that was a good experience for you guys. And I just like to welcome you now to the Q&A. I'm very pleased to be joined by Niv and Professor John. And so we're just going to go through your questions in Slido. Please write anything in that you feel compelled to ask, any question. It doesn't matter how big or small you think it might be. Please, anything, and we'll just see what we can do. And then if you see any questions already on the Slido that you like, please do thumb them up, or the ones near the top are more likely to be answered first. So yeah, let's get underway then. So the first question is, some people suffer throughout their entire lives with illness. What purpose would that person have in the eyes of God? And I'm going to give that to John first.
Thanks very much. It's good to be here, and not an easy question to start with, obviously. And you know, the truth is that people have been asking that question about the meaning of suffering for thousands of years. In fact, you can find in the Bible, even in the old Hebrew scriptures, where that question is being raised. Think, for instance, of the book of Job, who was portrayed as a righteous man, who then has an absolutely catastrophic series of apparently random and incredibly destructive events, including the death of many of his close family and himself suffering a very severe illness. And the whole question is then, well, what's the meaning behind it? And I mean, to cut the story short, after a great deal of internal debate and questioning, and Job keeps saying, if only I could see God, and if only I could put my questions to him. Eventually, God appears at the end of the book, and he says to Job, right, you wanted to ask me some questions. Okay, I'm here. But just first, I'm going to ask you some questions. And then he basically says, you know, how much do you really understand about the way the cosmos operates? Where were you when I created the world? Where were you? And he goes on asking these rhetorical questions. And in the end, Job says, I think I better shut up. And you never actually get in that book an answer to the question of suffering. I mean, fast forward to the New Testament when Jesus comes, and you would think, well, here is God in human form. At last, now Jesus is going to explain the meaning of suffering. And then amazingly, he doesn't, but something far more amazing and profound happens, because God in the person of Jesus actually enters into the experience of suffering. He weeps with people who are weeps. He takes into his own body the agony and destruction, and he dies a terrible death on the cross. So the Christian faith says, yes, there is a meaning in suffering, but it's not for us ultimately to understand it. But what we do know is that God himself enters into the experience of suffering. And in the end, the question is, are we going to say all suffering is meaningless and just random events, or is there a deep meaning behind it, which actually we can only sometimes get glimpses of?
I can see yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that was so helpful. Thank you. And it's worth saying that we're actually going to have a whole evening on just this question of suffering, not tomorrow night, but Thursday night. So please, if that's whet your appetite, come back. There's going to be an interview with someone who's talking a bit about their suffering. And we're going to have an opportunity to see a little bit more of what Professor Wyatt just said. So please do come back if that was your question.
Yeah, thank you. Next is the question, may people find their own value and identity during their lives by what they do? Existentialism. Is Christianity really necessary to find dignity in oneself? I'm going to pose that to Niv.
Thank you. It's a great question. And for some people, maybe you're a reader of someone like Albert Camus, actually, that seems to be the point, that in a meaningless cosmos, you can generate your own meaning. And that is somehow a courageous, life-affirming move to make. And I think we can all respect that. And certainly there's some appeal to it as well. I think the question we've been asking tonight, though, is whatever meaning I construct for myself is limited to the four walls of my experience and my perception. Is that good enough? Does that give me everything I need when life goes wrong and I'm searching for a meaning beyond the one I've made up for myself? Does that work for me when I see oppression and injustice in the lives of other people and I want to protest it? I want to say, not, I think this is wrong, in my opinion, this should end. I want to say that is wrong and it should stop. I'd put it to you that whenever it comes to things that really matter in life, the meaning that we construct for ourselves is never big enough. It just doesn't fit. It's a Procrustean bed, if you like. It's just not comfortable for life. And this isn't just about comfort. This is about being consistent in the things that we care about. So often when it comes to these issues of injustice, we don't tolerate people saying, well, I've made my own meaning here. You're just going to have to live with it. When different people's meanings in life collide, we need some way of arbitrating between the two and figuring it out. So yes, the existential option is there, but at the same time, there's a core of real despair. And I think the good news we've been trying to press into tonight is that it doesn't have to go that way. If Jesus is the one he says he is, then you're not actually a fool to care about love, to care about justice, to seek meaning. And these things are not just things you've cooked up in your head. They're not illusions you have to maintain. They're not a thin veneer on reality. With Jesus, push into these things and you find a deep and ultimately satisfying truth in Jesus. So the good news is you don't have to make meaning for yourself. You don't have to live in that slightly solipsistic, potentially narcissistic world. There's a bigger and better world to be part of. That's the message of the Christian faith. And it's such good news for people who are genuinely looking for meaning and don't want to be fobbed off on the kind they can make for themselves. Just very quickly, I want to say it's also quite a bourgeois position to be able to say, I make meaning for myself, everyone else gets on with it. If you talk to most people in the world today, they don't have the kind of comfort and privilege to get away with that kind of philosophizing. They're looking for more. And if you care about the kind of justice they're crying out for, and I take it many of us do, then I think we need to move beyond these sort of existential meaning manufacturing projects to find the real thing.
Yeah, it's a very interesting answer. It's very thought-provoking. Looking at the next few questions, they seem to follow a similar theme, and so I'm going to sort of combine them together, as it were. So the first one is, how do you explain evolution and the genealogy of Jesus basically dating Adam back to 6,000 years ago, and basically causing the Bible and evolution to contradict, seemingly? The next one goes, at what point does life begin? And then there's another one that says, how come some people in the Bible lived hundreds of years? So I'm sort of just going to combine these together and present them all to you, Professor John.
Great stuff. Okay, well, the way we interpret things like the genealogies in the Bible, obviously Bible scholars and so on have addressed these issues for centuries, and I'm by no means an expert, but it's pretty obvious that the genealogies that we often get in the Bible are not the same as modern genetic, the kind of thing that a clinical geneticist will do when they take a history, working out precise family relationships and so on. And so I think most people, particularly people who are scientists or who, like myself, medics, when we read the scriptures, we see really there are two. A helpful way that someone put it is there are two books. There's the book of scripture and there's the book of nature. And if you're a Christian like me, you believe that ultimately God wrote both of these books. So yes, there is the book of scripture, which teaches us about Jesus and about the revelation of God in a very particular way. But there's also the book of nature, which is sometimes described as general revelation. It's also God speaking. And therefore, what we have to do is to try and understand how these two books interrelate. And different Christians have come to different conclusions. But my own conclusion is that it is perfectly consistent to understand the way that evolutionary processes occur over millions of years, and that God can use these evolutionary processes in order to create life, in order to create human beings. What I don't believe is that evolution is an entirely random and meaningless and undirected process. So in that sense, I don't believe in the traditional Darwinian explanation of purely random chance and blind mechanisms. I personally believe that there are deeper structures in the way that life evolves and in the way that human beings have evolved, and that God has used these deep structures within the creation in order to achieve his own purposes. And so I think the question about when life begins from a evolutionary point of view is, I personally accept the dating that it actually starts on the planet Earth several billion years ago when life develops, although the precise way in which life evolves is still extremely mysterious. If we go all the way through to the womb and we say, when does life start in the womb, then it's pretty obvious biologically that life starts at the point when the sperm meets the egg. The important ethical question is, when is there a person that we have a duty to protect? And so that's not just a question of biology. When you put it in those terms, you realize that ultimately this is a philosophical question. And my own view is that however far I go back in my own history, personal history, however far back I go back into my mother's womb, there's never a point at which I can say that is not me. So if you think of your own development and you think of yourself just after you were born, and you think of yourself just before you were born, and you go all the way back, I don't think there's any point at which you can say, oh, that's just a blob. That wasn't me. And therefore, I don't think there's any point, however far you go back, where you can reliably say there isn't a person.
That's really insightful. Thanks so much. Can I just say a couple of things about the Bible questions that were being asked in that question? Just a little bit, it might be helpful. So if you were here last night for the Q&A, you might have remembered me saying that the miracles of Jesus aren't just party tricks. They're always accomplishing something. And the same is true in the genealogies we read about Jesus. There are two. There's one in Matthew, there's one in Luke. You can ask a question about why there are two, perhaps tomorrow night when we look at the historical Jesus. But the point in both those genealogies is not, hey, let me give you an exhaustive family tree. Both of those are making really important theological points. So in Matthew, it structures that you have 14 different generations between three key moments in the history of the Old Testament: Abraham, King David, and the exile. And in Luke, the point is to trace a genealogy all the way from Jesus back to Adam, and it ends the son of Adam and then the son of God. This sense that Jesus has come to be the Messiah for all of humanity from the very beginning. But neither of those genealogies are trying to give you an exhaustive, no blanks account of Jesus's lineage. And so we wouldn't be, I think, justified to use those to try to date the beginning of human life. So I think that argument just doesn't work with the genealogies themselves. Secondly, that question about very long-lived people, that was one of the questions, wasn't it, Robin?
Yeah, that was one of them, yeah.
And what's interesting there is, I want to say that the Bible is not a book I have mastered. It's a book I want to be mastered by, but there are loads of things about it I don't fully understand, and I'm trying to get my head around. I'm bringing my questions to it. I don't always have all the answers I'd like. I just want to point out, though, that actually in this case, there are some issues wherever you look in antiquity. One of the things you'll notice in ancient Near Eastern myths is that longevity is a common feature outside the Bible too. So when you look at extremely early writings from that part of the world, there are loads of accounts of people living for centuries. And in fact, there are other cultures which talk about people living for millennia. So what do you make of that? I think at that point, you then have another question about how do we interpret that? Were they counting things differently? What's going on? But I just want to say, this is not the Bible going off on one, and we're thinking, gosh, this is all a bit bizarre. This seems to be a feature of ancient Near Eastern literature that we kind of have to make sense of somehow. I have some theories, maybe you have some theories, but I feel like we all need to know that when we ask that question.
Yeah, that's a great answer. There's a lot more to unpack, and so we can all go a lot further with this. But obviously, with some of these questions, extra research is going to be a brilliant way to look into these things. Now, the next question, I think Professor John's already answered. Does life begin at conception? I think you've already tackled that earlier. Is there anything else that you would like to add to your previous answer, I guess?
No, I mean, I think, again, it's one of those ultimate philosophical questions which we're never going to be able to fully resolve. My own position, though, is therefore, if we can't be completely certain, it's much better to play safe. Obviously the question is it okay to destroy an early human life? If you're not certain whether there's a life there or not, what would you say? Well, the ethical right approach is to play safe. And I mean, to take a ridiculous analogy, suppose you were a guy who, when they wire up those tower blocks in order to destroy them, and they're all filled with dynamite everywhere, and there's a guy on the plunger and he's just about to destroy them. And just before he plunges it, he says, "You are sure you got all the people out, aren't you?" And if the answer is, "Well, I think so, I'm pretty sure," should you press the plunger? And I think the answer is no. If there's any possible chance that you might destroy life, then you play safe. And I would take the same view, therefore, when dealing with talking about very early human life inside the womb. If in doubt, play safe.
Yeah, definitely. Then the next question again ties into this similar topic. Is abortion eugenics by another name? And I think it's quite a harsh question, but I think also one to tackle.
Yeah. So I think what the questioner is referring to is what's sometimes called selective abortion, which is where you do a series of tests, either with ultrasound, genetics, or something else, to look for evidence of a disability or some abnormality of the unborn baby, and then, or the fetus, you then perform an abortion. And the argument goes, is this eugenics? Well, I think, eugenics interestingly, was a word which was developed long before the Nazis and was generally regarded as a very good thing. It literally means good genetics. And interestingly, at my own university, not at Imperial, but at UCL, the department that was called the Department of Eugenics. And it's only after the Second World War, it changed its name to become the Department of Genetics. But after the terrible evil things that happened in the Nazis, eugenics understandably got a terribly bad name. And I think it is true that there are parallels between the selectively destroying disabled lives in the womb and eugenics. It's argued the difference is, of course, that the Nazi eugenics was imposed by force, whereas selective eugenics, as it's practiced today in liberal societies, is done by choice. But that doesn't mean to say that there isn't a deeply troubling, I think there is a deeply troubling aspect to this idea of weeding out so-called imperfect human beings out of society. And that contrasts with the fundamental Christian instinct, which is to protect those who are most vulnerable. It's interesting, in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, there are several categories of people that are singled out, and they are widows and orphans and immigrants. And they are singled out because they're uniquely vulnerable. And the God of the Bible then says, you must defend those people because I am on their side. And so when we translate that into modern day society, I think that people with particular disabilities are those who deserve protection and care rather than identification and destruction before birth.
Yeah. So now the next question, I think a few questions follow a similar theme to this one. I'm going to present this to Niv. Let's move down slightly now. If my life and accomplishments are already planned by God, does that take away from the work I put in to achieve them?
Great question. Thank you. And not being entirely cheeky, please come back on Friday night when we think about our achievements and the value we find in them. Because if you really want that question to be thought through, we've put some time and thought into that with a really good interview. So please come back for that. But just in short to say that actually, whenever you look at the Bible, and Christians throughout history have all agreed on this, that actually there are two different things going on in the action of God and in the action of human beings. And those two things are mysteriously compatible in a way that doesn't cancel the other one out, so that human beings really do have meaningful agency in the things they do and a real responsibility to live the lives that they've been given. And the fact that God knows in advance what's happening doesn't clash with that or detract from that. And if it seems to you, oh, well, how does this work? If God knows everything, surely, and if he's planned it all, then surely my freedom's somehow impinged on. Then a bit like we were thinking back to yesterday, our issue is too small a view of God. God isn't just like us, but bigger. And it's not like he started before we did. So he starts with his great plan in time. And here we are, just helpless pawns in time. That's actually too small a view of God. God is outside of time. So his planning, his purposes, the stuff he's doing in time and in reality as we know it, doesn't happen the same way that it doesn't occur the same way that human actions within time and reality as we know it happen. And so there isn't a competition between the two of those things, and you are not less meaningful because of it. You are rather more meaningful because of it, because the decisions you're making, the choices you make, they happen against the backdrop of the significance God gives you and the others in the world that you deal with. And so you're not just sort of making meaning in the void. There is a bigger meaning. There's a vast story unfolding in reality. What's wonderful is being part of this big story doesn't squish you down. You actually do have decisions to make. You actually do have agency and responsibility for the decisions that you make.
Yeah, brilliant response. There's a question that's been really fighting its way up multiple times, so I'd be remiss
Oh
to
dear,
not say
that
it.
sounds ominous.
So it's a two-parter, and I'll be presenting this to Nib, but if Professor John, you have anything that you want to add at the end of it, then go for it. So we live in a society, and human societal morals may have roots in religion. But that's all it is what they're saying. For example, we don't call lions murderers when they kill. How can it be argued that these morals justify a higher meaning when they are societal constructs made by us and vary through time, is the question.
Great question. And I wonder if we could also throw in there as a side, another question on the slide, can't evolution account for our perception of meaning? Because I think that's very much on the side of this question. If we're self-aware enough to see how morality has changed over time, how various social conditions have shaped what people thought was right and wrong, then surely in evolution we have everything we need to explain the rise of morality in the first place. Perhaps we can even do a Sam Harris, like I mentioned, and allow science to tell us everything we need about ethics. Here's why that's problematic, and I hope what was mentioned in the talk and that quote from the philosopher following was helpful. Here's the problem: evolution can definitely inform the rise of morality, but what it cannot do is validate whether that morality is true or not. To think that it would is to commit what philosophers call the genetic fallacy. Just because we know how something arises does not mean that therefore we have judged its validity or not. So even if morality has developed through these evolutionary channels, that doesn't yet say anything about whether it's right or wrong. And therefore, I think this two-part question is a really important question. In many ways, it's the question facing modernity. If you know philosophy, you might be interested to know that this is basically a question that Friedrich Nietzsche is asking. He's saying, why do we stay wedded to concepts of good and evil when nature doesn't show us that? Nature just shows us the strong and the weak. An eagle is not evil for killing a lamb. A lamb may think that, but the lamb's just weak. You don't call the action of a lion in the Serengeti murder. Why do you call it that among humans? Now, Nietzsche's asking that question because he has the courage to genuinely step away from the Christian inheritance, which Professor White's been mentioning this evening, that sees compassion towards the weak as not just good, but the good, the thing that we're called to do. So therefore, this question is asking us something really uncomfortable. Could you live as if that were true? Could you live as if morality were just a game that various societies have played, a sort of emergent property from lots of different people coming up with moral ideas? Could you live as if the atrocities that we see in the news are genuinely on a level with what happens in the world of nature? And if you could, I'd want to suggest that you have bigger problems than we could deal with tonight. I've never met a single human being who genuinely thinks that that's all morality is. So even if evolution helps us understand how morality develops, that hasn't told us anything about its validity or not. And therefore, we have that huge question. Secondly, the question in some ways is a question of courage. Nietzsche would say, yes, embrace the courage that tells you there is no right and wrong in the abstract. Rather, there's only the strong and the weak. But if you can live with that, then I think you have some real issues. And I don't know anyone in the world who really does. I think all of us have been ineradicably shaped by the conviction that the weak are there to be protected, that it is good to do that. And that's something that we've directly inherited from Christianity. So I think that's the question I want to put back to that question of, could you live as if that were true? And if you don't live as if that were true, if genuine wrongdoing upsets you and you want it to be combated, if you want it to be overturned, then I'd suggest that you need a philosophy that makes sense of that. That doesn't just see morality as a matter of taste, but a matter of truth. Not something we've just invented, but something we've discovered.
Yeah, thanks. I really fantastic answer. I just want to add to that what evolution can't explain is the intensity with which human beings take moral issues. I mean, it's really extending what Niv has just said. I mean, evolution can explain why we might prefer to do some things and not prefer, right? Like we might prefer to eat food that tastes nice and not eat food that's rotting. You can see evolutionary explanations for preferences like that. But the extraordinary thing about the way that human deals with morality is that it has an intensity. People are prepared to die and have repeatedly died for their moral beliefs, for their utter convictions that something is right or that something is wrong and must be resisted. And evolution cannot explain why this construct, which just helps a bit of survival, why there is this extraordinary intensity about it. Whereas, of course, I think Christianity does. Christianity says that actually we're made to reflect the being and character of God himself. And God himself is the source of morality, is the source of goodness. And therefore, goodness matters to us and evil matters to us as human beings.
Yeah, definitely. And now, just being conscious of time, we're moving on to our final question for the night. And this is quite a popular one by the looks of it. And that is, on the claim that Christianity is unique in God coming into the world, what about avatars in Hinduism, and how is that different? I'm going to pose that to Niv.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you. And it's refreshing to hear the word avatar not in a sort of James Cameron cinema context. So thank you. That is a really good question. Here we are, Christianity, talking about God entering reality in person. And potentially we look at the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas, and we think, hang on, isn't this old hat? Don't we have plenty of that happening in Hinduism? A couple of differences that are so important that I think we still justify calling Christianity unique. Firstly, is the difference in the scale of revelation here. So the avatars of Hinduism, and I'm not an expert here, but I have grown up reading a lot of this stuff. You might be able to tell I have Indian origins, maybe the astute among you. One of the things that you'll notice there is that these are appearings of the divine. Sometimes there are sort of particularly, I don't know, notable figure like Krishna, for instance, and the relationship between Krishna and Vishnu. But in many ways, these are sort of temporary manifestations of the divine in form. What you have with Christianity is not the idea that one among many different gods has appeared temporarily in a form, but that the only God who's the ground of all being, the one who made everything for himself, has come in person, fully and finally, to take to himself a human existence that he will never, ever set aside. So it's a very different thing. We're in a different ball game here because the one and only has made himself known in an unprecedented and unparalleled way that will never be topped or bettered. That's why one of the things the Bible says, that Jesus is the last word on God, from God. He's everything God has to say in a person. There's no more to look for. There's not another appearing that's coming over the horizon. That's not what's going on. Secondly, and this is another really important thing, it's about what reality is, and particularly material reality. In Hinduism, what you don't have is an affirmation of material reality as objectively good and where the action is. Instead, you have a sense in which the real action is in the spiritual life. And so in many ways, our attachment to material reality is problematic. It's something we can be weaned off. Our goal is to pursue a oneness that is beyond this world and its limitations. Christianity could not be more different. Shaped by Judaism, it says that this world, this matter, this reality we inhabit is profoundly important. And it's worth hearing at the end of an evening like this. No, we are not only matter, but the fact is, being matter is nothing to be ashamed of, and matter matters to this God because he chose to step into this material reality, to take to himself a material existence, and therefore affirm the goodness of life in this world lived in a physical way. I think about my little daughter, who's 7 and a bit months old, whose understanding of the world is so small and minimal. She's nothing like an Imperial College student, and what she can get now is her needs for food, the joy of being cuddled, toys that she appreciates. All of these things she's doing, Christianity says, have been ennobled by the fact that God went right down to her level to experience the same kind of life and the same kind of things. That is extremely ennobling, because what it tells us is that the kind of life you live in the body is not something God has given up on. He's not calling you away from it. And true life is not to be found in escaping these things somehow. It's to be found in the commitment of God to this world that he will never revoke. So that's a really important difference, and one to take seriously. By the way, it's why all the science you do is so important and meaningful, because material reality is shot through with the goodness of God, who upholds it as the creator. And that's why Christianity is so ridiculously insistent on material reality. Church meets and gathers around things like baptism, which is a physical thing involving water, and a meal called the Lord's Supper, which has to be eaten. You can't just think about it and have spiritual thoughts. You've got to eat it to engage with this. Well, in many ways, that's something that's just been imprinted on Christian history. This matters because God has come to take the things of material reality and dignify them in becoming one of us and redeem them in his death and, above all, resurrection. I'm waffling here because there's so much we could say, but it's a great question. Thank you.
Brilliant response. Thank you, Niv. And now I think we'll draw stumps there. I'd like to say a massive thank you to Niv and a massive thank you to Professor John for joining us for this Q&A. Thank you guys for all the questions you said. I just want to quickly make a note that there was a very popular question on vaccines, and I'm aware that Professor John on his website has tackled this question. So Professor John, you want to quickly plug your website?
Have a plug. Thank you. Yeah, it's johnwyatt.com. So all one word, johnwyatt.com. And as Robin says, there's a whole lots of material there I've written on COVID vaccines, including the ethics from a Christian point of view, as well as the evidence as to many of the conspiracy theories which are going around at the moment about vaccines. So johnwyatt.com, yes, there's more information there. And you can send me a question through the website if you wish.
Brilliant. And finally, I'd just like to say, if you want to engage with any of this stuff further beyond this week and all these talks, then there's a contact form in the description. Please fill it in. We are running 3 different courses, as it were. Mondays with Mark, Curious Cafe, and one-to-ones. And so there's going to be something for you in one of those. I recommend all of them. They are brilliant. And so, yeah, if you have any questions that you would like to engage with beyond this, please do get in touch with the CU, even if it's just with anyone that you know in the CU. That would be wonderful. So yeah, we'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Every bit of information you gather on our body is there.